A 50-year-old wooden cabin changed everything. I had just finished restoring it, but to Karen, my neighbor and the self-appointed enforcer of the neighborhood, it was suddenly a serious threat. Every night, I caught her sneaking around on my security cameras, spying outside, drawing maps, scribbling suspicious notes. Then she made a critical mistake. She called 911. What happened next lasted exactly 45 seconds and ended when I pulled out a piece of paper, looked her straight in the eye, and said just one sentence. She froze, stepped back 3 times, her eyes wide as if she had just seen a ghost. How could a simple cabin inspection spiral so far out of control? Comment on where you're watching from, because you won't believe what was hidden behind those wooden walls. The cabin had been mine for exactly 6 months and 3 days. My grandfather, Samuel Blackwood, left it to me when he passed, along with a note that simply read, "For Ethan, who understands that some things are worth preserving." At 28, I thought I understood what he meant. The cabin represented family, tradition, and the simple satisfaction of working with your hands to build something lasting. What I didn't realize was that he'd also left me a war I never asked to fight. I'd been living in Portland, grinding through 60-hour weeks as a software engineer for a startup that burned through venture capital faster than I burned through coffee. My severance package would cover 6 months of expenses, maybe 8 if I lived carefully. The cabin sat on 3 acres in Maplewood Heights, about 40 minutes outside the city, where housing developments had sprouted around the original homesteads like expensive mushrooms after rain. I could live rent-free while I restored the place, maybe even start that custom woodworking business I'd been dreaming about since college. The cabin itself was a testament to my grandfather's craftsmanship, built in 1973 from Oregon pine he'd milled himself, featuring hand-carved details that would cost a fortune to replicate today. The foundation was solid concrete. The electrical system had been updated in 2015, and the plumbing worked perfectly despite Karen's later claims about safety hazards. My grandfather had been something of a legend in these parts. Samuel Blackwood arrived when this area was still mostly farmland and forest, back when neighbors helped each other raise barns instead of filing HOA complaints. He'd worked as a carpenter and contractor, helping build half the original homes in what would become Maplewood Heights. People still spoke about him with genuine fondness at the hardware store and post office. "Your granddad was a good man," they'd say, always willing to lend a hand. I'd spent every summer at the cabin from age 8 to 18, learning to use tools that were older than my parents. Granddad taught me to measure twice and cut once, to respect the wood's natural grain, to build things that would last longer than the person who made them. The neighborhood had changed dramatically since those childhood visits. Where once there'd been modest ranch homes on large lots, McMansions now crowded every available space. The houses were beautiful in a catalog sort of way, all granite countertops and vaulted ceilings, but they lacked the character that came from being built by someone who planned to live in them forever. Property values had skyrocketed, which was great for longtime residents but created pressure for everyone else. That pressure had a name, and it was Karen Steinfeld. I first met Karen on moving day, before I'd even finished unloading my truck. She appeared at my doorstep like a well-dressed storm cloud, clipboard in hand and a smile that never reached her eyes. In her early 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and clothes that screamed, "I have opinions about your landscaping choices," she radiated the kind of confidence that comes from being used to getting your way. "You must be Samuel's grandson," she said, and I could already hear the judgment in her voice. "I'm Karen Steinfeld, Vice President of the Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association. I wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood and discuss some concerns we have about your property." She gestured toward the cabin with her pen like she was identifying evidence at a crime scene. I should have seen the warning signs right then, but I was tired from moving, still raw from losing both my job and my grandfather within 6 months of each other. "I appreciate you stopping by," I told her. "I'm planning to restore the cabin to its original condition, maybe improve on it. My grandfather always maintained it well, so I don't think there are any serious issues." Karen's smile became even more brittle. "I'm sure you do, dear. But you have to understand that neighborhoods evolve. What was appropriate in 1973 might not meet today's standards. The HOA has certain covenants about property appearance, and frankly, your cabin creates some challenges." She flipped through papers on her clipboard like she was consulting a legal brief. "There are building code compliance issues, aesthetic considerations for the neighborhood, and of course, the impact on surrounding property values." That's when she dropped the first bomb. The cabin was built before the HOA was established, but that doesn't mean it's exempt from current community standards. We have procedures for addressing non-conforming structures. She handed me a manila folder thick with documents. These are the relevant bylaws and a preliminary list of violations that need to be addressed. I'm sure a bright young man like yourself can understand the importance of being a good neighbor. I opened the folder and found myself staring at 12 pages of alleged violations. Everything from non-standard exterior materials to landscaping, not in conformity with neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. Some of the complaints were so petty they bordered on ridiculous. My grandfather's hand-carved mailbox post violated the uniform signage standards adopted in 2020. This seems pretty extensive, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Some of these items are about personal preference rather than actual safety or legal issues. My grandfather built this place to last. It's been here longer than most of the other houses in the neighborhood. That's exactly the problem, Karen replied. And for just a moment, her diplomatic mask slipped. I saw something harder underneath, something that looked like old resentment. Times change, Mr. Blackwood. What worked in the past doesn't always work now. The other residents have invested significant money in maintaining our community standards. It's not fair to them to have one property that brings down the whole neighborhood. She left shortly after that, but not before mentioning that the HOA would be monitoring the situation closely and that I had 30 days to respond to the violations list. As I watched her walk back to her pristine white Mercedes SUV, I noticed she took the long way around the circular street, getting a good look at the cabin from every angle. That night, I sat on the cabin's front porch with a beer and my grandfather's old toolbox, reading through the violation notice more carefully. Some of the language was clearly designed to intimidate rather than inform. References to legal action and property liens peppered throughout. But I also noticed something interesting. Several of the alleged violations cited HOA bylaws that had been adopted years after the cabin was built. I didn't know Karen was already preparing a devastating follow-up attack that would threaten to take away everything my grandfather had built. And she'd just found the perfect partner to help her do it. Karen's perfect partner turned out to be Clayton Morrison, the city's building inspector, and her old buddy from the legal community. I should have known something was fishy when Morrison showed up at my door 3 days after Karen's visit, clipboard in hand and an attitude that screamed I've already made up my mind. He was a heavy-set guy in his late 40s, with the kind of mustache that suggested he took himself very seriously. Wearing a city inspector jacket like it was a badge of honor. Anonymous complaint about potential safety violations, he announced. Not bothering with pleasantries. I need to conduct a thorough inspection of the premises. The way he said it, you'd think my cabin was a meth lab instead of a 50-year-old family home. But what caught my attention was how he seemed to know exactly where to look for problems, like he'd been briefed in advance. Morrison spent 3 hours going through my cabin with the enthusiasm of a treasure hunter, but somehow missed all the quality craftsmanship while focusing on imaginary issues. He tested electrical outlets that worked perfectly, examined plumbing that had never leaked, and scrutinized structural elements that had weathered 5 decades without complaint. I followed him around, taking notes and photos of my own, which seemed to irritate him considerably. You don't need to document my work, he snapped when he caught me photographing his testing process. I'm a certified professional. What struck me as odd was how he kept taking pictures but never actually performed any real tests. No voltage meters. No pressure tests. No structural measurements. Just a lot of dramatic note-taking and head-shaking, like he was performing for an invisible audience. Then Morrison dropped his bombshell, asbestos insulation in the walls. This is a serious health hazard, he declared, pointing to what looked like perfectly normal insulation in the utility room. Asbestos was commonly used in construction during the 1970s. This entire structure may need to be stripped down to the studs and rebuilt to current safety standards. He handed me an official-looking report with the city seal, complete with photos and technical jargon that made it sound like my cabin was a ticking time bomb. You'll need to hire a certified abatement company for testing and potential removal. Until then, I'm recommending the structure be considered unsafe for habitation. The estimated cost for asbestos abatement, according to his helpful pamphlet, could run anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000. Something about Morrison's performance didn't sit right with me, so I did what any reasonable person would do in the digital age. I investigated. Oregon is a one-party consent state for recording conversations, which meant I could legally document our interactions without telling him. More importantly, I started researching Morrison's background and discovered some interesting connections. His Facebook friends list included Karen Steinfeld, and their message history showed they'd been in contact for months before his surprise inspection. Screenshots of their conversations revealed planning sessions disguised as casual chats. "Hope you can help with that problem property we discussed," Karen had written. "Always happy to help ensure community safety," Morrison had replied. But the real smoking gun came when I requested an independent asbestos test from an EPA-certified laboratory. My grandfather had been meticulous about maintaining records, and I found documentation proving he'd completely renovated the insulation in 2015, using modern materials that were certified asbestos-free. The lab results came back exactly as I expected. 0 asbestos detected anywhere in the structure. Morrison's professional assessment was complete fiction, and I now had scientific proof to back up my claims. When I called Morrison to inform him of the results, his response was telling. Instead of admitting his error or asking to see the lab report, he immediately became defensive and suggested the testing company might not be properly certified. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her campaign to social media warfare. She created a Facebook group called Concerned Maplewood Residents and quickly recruited 847 members, mostly neighbors who'd joined out of curiosity rather than genuine concern. Her posts were masterfully crafted propaganda, featuring carefully angled photos that made my cabin look worse than it was, combined with emotional appeals about children's safety and protecting our community investment. She tagged city council members, local news outlets, and even the fire chief in posts that painted my family home as a neighborhood menace. The comment section became an echo chamber of property value paranoia and safety concerns that bore no resemblance to reality. What bothered me wasn't just Karen's dishonesty, but how effective her manipulation was proving to be. Neighbors who'd never spoken to me were suddenly experts on building safety and property law. Mrs. Patterson from 2 streets over felt qualified to diagnose structural problems she'd never seen. Mr. Goldman started crossing the street to avoid walking past my property, as if the cabin might collapse on him. The few neighbors who remembered my grandfather fondly, like Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez, were being drowned out by manufactured outrage and fear-mongering. I realized I wasn't just fighting Karen anymore. I was fighting a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to isolate me from community support. But Karen had made one crucial mistake in her rush to destroy my credibility. While she was busy building her social media empire and manufacturing safety concerns, I was quietly building a case that would expose everything. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to discover something in my grandfather's basement that would change everything and give me the ammunition I needed to fight back. The basement of my grandfather's cabin held secrets I never expected to find. What started as a simple cleanup project to make room for my woodworking tools turned into a treasure hunt that would change everything. Tucked behind decades of carefully organized storage, I discovered a file cabinet that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The metal was slightly rusted, but the lock still worked with a key I found taped to the bottom of Granddad's workbench. Inside were meticulously organized folders containing 47 years of property documentation. From the original building permits to utility easements I didn't even know existed. My grandfather had been more than just careful about record keeping. He'd been preparing for a war that I was only now beginning to understand. Each document was filed chronologically and cross-referenced, like he knew someday his family would need to prove their right to exist in this place. The first major discovery was a conservation easement dated the 15th of March, 1995, 24 years before the HOA was even established. My grandfather had voluntarily donated the development rights to the Oregon Land Trust, permanently protecting the 3 acres from any commercial or high-density residential development. The legal language was crystal clear. The property could never be subdivided, never be used for anything other than single-family residential purposes, and never be developed beyond its current footprint. Karen's secret dream of turning my land into luxury townhomes wasn't just unlikely, it was legally impossible for all eternity. The conservation easement was irrevocable, recorded with the state, and backed by federal environmental protection laws that would make any developer's lawyer run screaming from the courthouse. But that wasn't the only bombshell waiting in those dusty files. As I dug deeper, I found correspondence between my grandfather and various city officials, dating back to 2019, when the Maplewood Heights HOA was first being organized. The letters revealed a fascinating power struggle I'd never heard about. Samuel Blackwood hadn't just been a respected community member. He'd been actively involved in establishing the HOA's bylaws and governance structure. More importantly, He'd advocated for several unusual provisions that most HOAs would never consider. One particular letter to the HOA's founding attorney stood out. "We need to ensure that longtime residents aren't pushed out by newcomers who don't understand our community's history. Family continuity should be protected, especially for properties that predate this organization." That's when I found the envelope marked "For Ethan, when the wolves come." My hands shook as I opened it, because somehow my grandfather had predicted this exact scenario. Inside was a notarized document that made my heart skip a beat. Samuel Blackwood had been elected HOA president in November 2020, just 2 months before he passed away. He'd never had the chance to take office, but the position had legally passed to me as his designated heir, according to a clause he'd personally lobbied to include in the HOA bylaws. Article 7. Section 3 specifically addressed succession of elected positions due to death or incapacitation of the elected individual. The provision allowed for transfer to a direct family member who met basic residency requirements, which I now did by living in the cabin full-time. I spent the next 3 days researching every detail of this inheritance clause, consulting with a property rights attorney named Sarah Kim who specialized in HOA law. According to her analysis, my grandfather's election was completely valid. The succession clause was legally binding, and my claim to the presidency was ironclad. "It's unusual," she admitted during our phone consultation, "but not unprecedented. Some smaller communities have family succession provisions to maintain institutional knowledge and prevent hostile takeovers." The beauty of the situation was that Karen had no idea this clause existed. She'd been operating under the assumption that she was dealing with a powerless property owner who could be bullied into submission. Instead, she'd been unknowingly attacking her future boss. While I was processing this incredible discovery, I also continued investigating Morrison's pattern of fraudulent inspections. Cross-referencing his official reports with complaints filed by other property owners revealed a disturbing trend. The Rodriguez family had been forced to replace a perfectly functional septic system for $8,000 based on Morrison's findings. Mrs. Thompson had paid $15,000 for a new roof, after Morrison claimed structural deficiencies that an independent engineer later proved were non-existent. In every case, the property owners had been targeted after disagreeing with Karen about some HOA issue or community policy. The pattern was so obvious once you knew what to look for. Morrison would find expensive problems that required immediate attention. Property owners would either pay up or face legal action, and Karen would benefit from either compliance or forced sales. The evidence against Morrison was becoming overwhelming. But I needed one more piece of proof before I could expose the whole scheme. That's when I noticed something odd about the signatures on his inspection reports. Having spent years in software development, I'd developed an eye for patterns and inconsistencies. Morrison's signature on my asbestos report looked different from his signatures on other official documents I'd obtained from the city clerk's office. The pen pressure was wrong, the letter spacing was inconsistent, and several flourishes that appeared in his genuine signatures were missing entirely. When I compared the signatures under magnification, it became clear that someone had forged Morrison's name on my inspection report. Either Morrison was so careless that he couldn't sign his name consistently, or someone else had been filling out paperwork in his name. Karen had no idea that her perfect plan was about to collapse spectacularly. Tomorrow night's emergency HOA meeting would give her the perfect stage to hang herself, and I was going to let her do it in front of the entire community. She thought she was organizing my public execution, but she was setting up her downfall. The only question was whether I should tell her beforehand or let her walk blindly into the trap she'd set for herself. The 24 hours before Karen's emergency HOA meeting felt like the calm before a hurricane. I spent most of that time organizing my evidence into a presentation that would systematically dismantle every lie she'd told about my property. But more importantly, I was watching her dig her own grave deeper with each passing hour. Karen had been busy making phone calls, sending emails, and posting updates to her Facebook group about tomorrow night's important community safety meeting. She was so confident in her victory that she'd even reserved a private dining room at Romano's Italian restaurant for what she was calling a celebration dinner after the meeting. The hubris was almost impressive, if it wasn't so completely misguided. I decided to do some reconnaissance around the neighborhood, ostensibly checking my mailbox and doing yard work, but really observing how the community was responding to Karen's propaganda campaign. The results were more encouraging than I'd expected. Mrs. Chen from next door approached me while I was trimming some overgrown bushes near the property line. "Ethan, "I hope you know that not everyone believes what Karen's been saying," she whispered, glancing around like she was afraid of being overheard. "Some of us remember your grandfather and the kind of man he was. We also remember when Karen tried to force the Hendersons to remove their vegetable garden because it wasn't aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards." She handed me a small piece of paper with phone numbers written on it. "These are neighbors who want to support you but are afraid to speak up publicly. Karen has a way of making life difficult for people who cross her." Mr. Rodriguez stopped by later that evening while I was reviewing my grandfather's documents on the front porch. "I've been thinking about that septic system inspection," he said, settling into the chair next to mine. "Morrison claimed our system was failing, but we'd had it pumped and inspected by an independent company just 6 months earlier. They said it was in perfect condition. When I showed Morrison their report, he said they weren't city certified, and their opinion didn't matter." Rodriguez shook his head in frustration. "We paid the $8,000 because we couldn't afford to fight the city. But now I'm wondering how many other families have been scammed by this same scheme." The pattern was becoming clearer by the hour, and I was starting to realize that Karen and Morrison had been running this con for years. Meanwhile, I was gathering intelligence on tomorrow night's meeting through completely legal means. The community center's event calendar showed that Karen had booked the large conference room for 60 people, with requests for a microphone system and projection screen. She'd invited not just residents but also City Council member Patricia Walsh, Fire Chief Thompson, and, of course, Morrison himself. The local newspaper had been contacted, and even Channel 7 News was planning to send a reporter to cover what they thought would be a story about HOA accountability. Karen was creating the perfect audience for her public humiliation, complete with media coverage to ensure maximum exposure. The most interesting development came when I caught Morrison in the act of shredding documents behind the city building during my lunch break. I'd driven downtown to file some paperwork at the county clerk's office when I spotted him in the parking lot, frantically feeding papers into a mobile shredding truck. When he saw me watching, his face went white, and he quickly closed the lid of the shredding bin. "Just disposing of old inspection reports," he called out. But his voice was shaking. "Regular document maintenance, you understand." The fact that he felt the need to destroy evidence suggested he knew his house of cards was about to collapse. I took several photos of him at the shredding truck, including close-ups of the timestamp on my phone to establish when this suspicious activity had occurred. That evening, I made a decision that would prove crucial to tomorrow's confrontation. Instead of revealing my trump card immediately, I would let Karen present her case first and commit to every lie publicly before exposing the truth. This strategy would serve two purposes. It would ensure that everyone in the room heard her false claims directly from her mouth, and it would make her eventual humiliation more complete and memorable. I spent hours crafting my response to maximize the dramatic impact, timing each revelation to build toward the ultimate bombshell that would destroy her credibility forever. I also took care of some practical preparations that night. I made copies of every important document and stored them in multiple locations, including my attorney's office and a safe deposit box at the bank. I charged all my electronic devices and tested my recording equipment to make sure I could document every moment of tomorrow's meeting. Most importantly, I practiced my presentation until I could deliver it calmly and confidently, even under pressure. This wasn't just about defending my property anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of corruption that had been harming my neighbors for years. The final piece of intelligence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, Karen's most vocal supporter and the HOA treasurer, called me around 9 o'clock that evening. "I need to tell you something," she said, and I could hear the distress in her voice. "I've been reviewing the HOA financial records, and there are some irregularities that don't make sense. Money allocated for legal consultations that I never approved. Payments to inspection services that weren't authorized by the board." She paused, and I could practically hear her connecting the dots. "Karen has been making financial decisions without board approval, and I'm starting to think some of those decisions weren't legitimate." Tomorrow night's meeting was going to be more explosive than Karen could imagine. She thought she was organizing my public execution, but she was setting the stage for the most spectacular downfall in HOA history. The Maplewood Heights Community Center had never seen anything like this. By 7 o'clock, every seat in the large conference room was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. I counted 63 residents, plus city officials, media representatives, and a handful of curiosity seekers who'd heard about the drama through social media. Karen had positioned herself at the front of the room behind a podium, looking every inch the professional in her navy blue blazer and carefully styled hair. She'd prepared a PowerPoint presentation that was already loaded on the projection screen, featuring dramatic photos of my cabin that somehow made it look like a condemned crack house rather than a well-maintained family home. The woman knew how to stage a performance. I'll give her that. Channel 7's reporter had set up her camera in the perfect position to capture Karen's presentation, while the newspaper photographer was snapping shots of the packed room. City Councilwoman Patricia Walsh sat in the front row with her tablet ready to take notes, and Fire Chief Thompson looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Morrison stood near the back corner, nervously adjusting his tie and checking his phone every 30 seconds. I had deliberately chosen a seat in the last row, manila envelope in my lap, watching the show unfold exactly as I'd predicted. The energy in the room was electric with anticipation, like everyone sensed they were about to witness something significant. They had no idea how right they were. Karen began her presentation with the practiced confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight she'd picked. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community's safety and property values, she announced, clicking through slides that showed carefully angled photos of my cabin's exterior. Each image had been manipulated with lighting and perspective to emphasize every weathered board and minor imperfection, while completely ignoring the solid foundation and quality construction that any honest observer would notice. This 50-year-old structure represents multiple violations of current building codes, HOA covenants, and basic safety standards that put our entire neighborhood at risk. She spoke about foundation concerns, electrical hazards, and structural deficiencies with the authority of someone who'd rehearsed this speech multiple times. The audience was nodding along, especially the newer residents who'd never known my grandfather and had no context for the history behind the property. Karen's lies became more elaborate and specific as she warmed to her performance. Independent analysis has revealed that this property poses fire hazards due to outdated electrical systems that haven't been updated since the 1970s, she declared, despite knowing full well that my grandfather had completely rewired the cabin in 2015. The septic system is failing and could contaminate groundwater throughout our neighborhood, she continued, fabricating environmental threats that would terrify any responsible homeowner. Most concerning of all, the structure's foundation has shifted over the decades, creating structural instability that could result in collapse during the next major storm. I watched neighbors I'd never met whispering anxiously to each other, completely buying into Karen's manufactured crisis narrative. Morrison stepped forward to present his official findings, pulling out the same fabricated inspection report he'd shown me weeks earlier. As a certified building inspector with 15 years of experience, I can confirm that this structure contains multiple safety violations, he declared, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his lies. Most critically, we've identified asbestos insulation throughout the building, creating a serious health hazard for not just the occupant but potentially the entire neighborhood. Several residents gasped audibly when he mentioned the asbestos, and I could see mothers unconsciously pulling their children closer. Morrison went on to describe imaginary electrical problems that could cause fires, fictional plumbing issues that might contaminate the water supply, and structural concerns that existed only in his falsified documentation. He even produced official-looking photographs that had been digitally altered to show problems that didn't exist. The emotional manipulation reached its peak when Karen returned to the podium for her closing argument. I know this is difficult, but we have to think about our children's safety and our community's future, she said, her voice taking on a tone of manufactured maternal concern that would have been Oscar-worthy if it wasn't so completely false. Property values in Maplewood Heights have increased by 37% over the past 5 years because we've maintained high standards. One substandard property can drag down values for everyone within a quarter-mile radius. She gestured toward me in the back row like I was Exhibit A in a criminal trial, and I could feel dozens of eyes turning to study me with mixtures of pity and resentment. Mr. Blackwood seems like a nice young man, but he's clearly in over his head with this renovation project. The responsible thing to do is to give the HOA authority to require either full compliance with current standards or removal of the structure entirely. The room's energy was reaching a fever pitch as Karen prepared to call for her decisive vote. I could see Mrs. Chen was shifting uncomfortably in her seat, clearly torn between her loyalty to my grandfather's memory and the fear that Karen was instilling in everyone around her. Rodriguez looked angry but uncertain, probably remembering his own experience with Morrison's fraudulent inspection. Even some of the residents who'd expressed private support for me seemed to be wavering under the weight of Karen's systematic fear-mongering and Morrison's false authority. That's when Karen made the fatal mistake that would destroy her forever. I motioned for an immediate vote authorizing the HOA board to take whatever action is necessary to resolve this safety hazard, she announced with the confidence of someone who'd never considered the possibility of losing. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I could see the satisfaction spreading across her face as she prepared to deliver the killing blow to my family's legacy. Mrs. Patterson, still operating under Karen's influence despite her growing doubts about the financial irregularities, quickly seconded the motion with a nervous "I second," that motion that sounded more like a question than a statement. All those in favor of granting emergency authority to address the cabin situation? Karen called out, and I watched as roughly 20 hands rose throughout the room. It wasn't anywhere close to a majority of the 63 residents present, but Karen had been counting on intimidation and manufactured urgency to carry the day. She'd also been banking on the fact that most people don't understand parliamentary procedure and wouldn't realize that a simple majority vote requires more than 32 affirmative votes from the total attendance. Motion carries, Karen declared triumphantly, apparently deciding that basic math was optional when you controlled the meeting and had the microphone. The room erupted in confused murmurs as people tried to figure out if the vote had passed, but Karen was already basking in what she thought was her moment of ultimate victory. She turned toward me with a smile that looked more like a predator's snarl, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who'd just crushed an enemy. "I'm sure you understand that this is for the good of the community, Mr. Blackwood. You have 30 days to bring your property into full compliance or face legal action for its removal." That's when I stood up slowly, manila envelope in hand, and said the words that would change everything. "There's one problem with that vote." The room fell completely silent, as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire gathering. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence, every whisper died away, and even the camera equipment seemed to pause in anticipation. I walked toward the front with deliberate, measured steps, every eye in the room following my movement like I was walking to the gallows. You can't vote on something you have no authority over. I opened the envelope with theatrical precision, letting the moment build as Karen's confident expression began to shift into something that looked suspiciously like dawning horror. "I'm the HOA president," I announced, pulling out the document that would end Karen's reign of terror forever. "And this meeting is hereby adjourned." The words hit the room like a physical force, and I watched Karen's face undergo the most spectacular transformation I'd ever witnessed. Her confident smile crumbled into shock, then disbelief, then something approaching pure terror as the implications of my announcement sank in. Karen's face went completely white, as if all the blood had suddenly drained from her body. She stepped backward once, twice, 3 times, exactly as I'd described in my opening story, her high heels clicking against the floor in the otherwise silent room. Her eyes went wide like she'd seen a ghost, because in a way, she had. The ghost of my grandfather's foresight had just reached out from beyond the grave to destroy her carefully constructed empire of lies and intimidation. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out, like she'd forgotten how to speak. The room exploded into chaos that was beautiful to behold. Reporters rushed forward with questions flying. Residents started talking all at once in voices that ranged from confused to excited to angry, and Morrison looked like he was about to have a complete nervous breakdown. But Karen just stood there, frozen in disbelief, as her perfect plan crumbled around her in exactly 45 seconds, just like I'd promised in my opening hook. The aftermath of the emergency meeting was swift and devastating for Karen's empire of corruption. Within 48 hours, I had exercised my presidential authority to suspend her from the vice president position and called for a comprehensive audit of all HOA financial records. The community was still buzzing with shock from my dramatic revelation, but now they wanted answers about how deep the corruption went. Mrs. Patterson, despite her initial loyalty to Karen, proved to be invaluable in uncovering the financial irregularities she'd hinted at during our phone conversation. As the treasurer, she had access to bank records and expenditure reports that painted a damning picture of systematic embezzlement and fraud, stretching back nearly 3 years. The numbers were staggering and infuriating in equal measure. Karen had authorized $18,000 in legal consultation fees to a firm that turned out to be her attorney, handling her divorce proceedings rather than any HOA business. Another $12,000 had been paid to Morrison's inspection services for evaluations that were never requested by the board and never resulted in legitimate reports. The pattern was clear and criminal. Karen had been using HOA funds as her slush fund, while simultaneously terrorizing residents with fake violations and manufactured compliance costs. Every family that had been forced to pay for unnecessary repairs had essentially been funding Karen's legal bills and Morrison's cooperation in the scam. The victims started coming forward once word spread about the investigation. Mrs. Rodriguez broke down in tears when she learned that the $8,000 they'd scraped together for septic system replacement had been based on a completely fraudulent inspection. We had to borrow against our house to pay for that, she told me during a community meeting I'd organized to hear from affected families. My husband worked double shifts for 6 months to make the loan payments, all because that man lied to us. The Thompson family had an even more heartbreaking story. They'd used their daughter's college fund to pay for the $15,000 roof replacement that Morrison had deemed urgently necessary for structural safety. Independent contractors confirmed that their original roof had been in excellent condition and could have lasted another decade. The evidence against Morrison was becoming overwhelming, and the pressure was getting to him. I'd been documenting his increasingly erratic behavior, including 3 more trips to the document shredding truck and what appeared to be late-night visits to Karen's house to coordinate their stories. But criminals rarely honor loyalty when facing serious consequences. And Morrison proved to be no exception. When faced with mounting evidence of fraud and the possibility of felony charges, he cracked faster than a dropped egg. His attorney contacted me through the city's legal department with an offer: full cooperation and testimony against Karen, in exchange for a plea deal that would keep him out of prison. Morrison's confession was a masterclass in small-town corruption. He detailed how Karen had initially approached him with concerns about certain properties, gradually escalating to direct payments for fabricated inspection reports. The asbestos claim about my cabin had been Karen's idea, designed to create such an expensive remediation requirement that I'd be forced to sell the property. Morrison provided copies of text messages, email communications, and even recorded phone calls where Karen explicitly instructed him to find expensive problems with specific properties. The conspiracy had been operating for over 3 years, targeting families who opposed Karen's increasingly authoritarian control over the neighborhood. The legal consequences for Karen began falling like dominoes. The district attorney's office opened a criminal investigation into embezzlement, conspiracy, and filing false official reports. Civil lawsuits were filed by every family that had been scammed, seeking not just restitution for their financial losses but punitive damages for the emotional distress and family hardship caused by the fraudulent scheme. The State Bar Association launched their own investigation into Karen's professional conduct, and her law license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. Even her homeowner's insurance company dropped her coverage when they learned about the fraud allegations, leaving her personally liable for all legal defense costs. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was Karen's complete social isolation within the community she'd once dominated. The same neighbors who had feared her authority were now openly discussing her crimes and sharing stories about her years of bullying behavior. The Facebook group she'd created to attack me became a forum for victims to connect and plan their legal strategies. Property values didn't suffer from the scandal. If anything, they increased as word spread that Maplewood Heights had successfully purged itself of HOA corruption and was now committed to transparent, democratic governance. Mrs. Chen was elected as the new vice president in a special election that saw record turnout among residents. Mr. Rodriguez accepted the position of treasurer, bringing his background in accounting to ensure that financial irregularities could never happen again. We implemented new bylaws requiring board approval for any expenditure over $500, mandatory annual audits by independent accountants, and term limits to prevent any single person from accumulating too much power. The new HOA structure emphasized community building over rule enforcement, organizing neighborhood events and improvement projects that brought families together rather than driving them apart. The investigation also revealed that Karen's house was quietly listed for sale at below market value, as legal fees and potential judgments made her financial situation increasingly desperate. Morrison lost his city job and faced professional destruction that would prevent him from ever working in building inspection again. The web of corruption they'd built together was completely dismantled, but the damage they'd caused to innocent families would take years to fully repair. I had one final surprise waiting for Karen that would ensure her defeat wasn't just legal and financial, but deeply personal. Something that would prove that justice sometimes comes with perfect poetic timing. 6 months after Karen's spectacular downfall, Maplewood Heights had transformed into the kind of community my grandfather had always envisioned. The cabin restoration was finally complete, and the results exceeded even my expectations. What had started as a simple renovation project had become a labor of love that honored both my grandfather's craftsmanship and my vision for the future. The local home improvement magazine featured the cabin in their Historical Preservation Success Story edition, praising the careful balance between maintaining original character and incorporating modern safety features. Property values throughout the neighborhood had increased by 12%, not because of Karen's authoritarian enforcement, but because of genuine community pride and collaboration. The monthly community gatherings at my cabin workshop had become the social heartbeat of Maplewood Heights. Every second Saturday, neighbors would bring their children to learn traditional woodworking skills, share potluck dinners, and work on collective improvement projects that benefited everyone. Mrs. Chen organized a community garden where residents could grow vegetables together, while Mr. Rodriguez started a tool lending library in his garage. The same Facebook group that Karen had used for propaganda became a platform for coordinating neighborhood watch, organizing block parties, and celebrating milestones like new babies and graduations. The difference in community spirit was remarkable, like someone had lifted a heavy blanket of fear and suspicion that had been smothering genuine human connection. Karen's legal troubles had reached their inevitable conclusion with a plea agreement that satisfied both justice and practicality. She received 18 months of probation, 1,500 hours of community service, and a restitution order requiring her to pay back $52,000 to affected families and the HOA Treasury. The criminal conviction resulted in automatic disbarment, effectively ending her legal career and ensuring she could never again use professional credentials to intimidate or defraud others. Her financial situation had become so desperate that she'd been forced to sell her house at a significant loss, using most of the proceeds to pay legal fees and begin satisfying the restitution judgment. Morrison's consequences were equally thorough and permanent. His criminal conviction for falsifying official documents and conspiracy had resulted in termination from his city position and permanent disqualification from any government employment. The Building Contractors Association had revoked his certification, and civil lawsuits from multiple victims had left him financially ruined. He'd been forced to move to another state to find work, presumably in a field where his reputation for corruption wouldn't precede him. The city had implemented new oversight procedures for building inspections, including mandatory second opinions for any findings that would require expensive remediation. But the most satisfying twist of poetic justice came when Karen's former house was purchased by the Martinez family, a young military couple with 3 children and a disabled veteran father who used a wheelchair. When I learned about their situation during a casual conversation with their real estate agent, I saw an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of community values that my grandfather had always embodied. Instead of celebrating Karen's misfortune, we would transform her former symbol of authority into a beacon of genuine neighborly support. The entire community mobilized to help the Martinez family modify their new home for accessibility. I coordinated the construction of a beautiful wheelchair ramp using techniques my grandfather had taught me, while other neighbors contributed materials, labor, and expertise. Mrs. Chen organized meal deliveries during the construction period, and Mr. Rodriguez used his accounting skills to help the family navigate VA benefits and local disability resources. Even the children in the neighborhood got involved, creating welcome signs and helping with landscaping that would be easy for Mr. Martinez to maintain from his wheelchair. The day we finished the accessibility modifications, I noticed a familiar white Mercedes SUV driving slowly past the construction site. Karen had returned to collect some forgotten belongings from the house, and she witnessed the entire community working together to help a family in need. Our eyes met for just a moment through her car window, and I saw something I'd never expected. Not anger or resentment, but what looked like genuine regret. She drove away without stopping, and according to neighbors, that was the last time anyone saw her in Maplewood Heights. The final revelation came when I discovered my grandfather's ultimate gift hidden in his workshop. While organizing his tool collection, I found a sealed envelope marked, "When the dust settles." Inside was documentation of mineral rights that he'd quietly secured in 1987, including a geological survey indicating potential natural gas deposits beneath the property. The estimated value of drilling rights was over $200,000, money that Karen's scheme could never have touched even if she'd succeeded in forcing me to sell. My grandfather had protected our family legacy on multiple levels, ensuring that future generations would have both the land and the resources to maintain it. As I sat on the cabin's front porch that evening, watching the Martinez children play safely in their newly accessible yard, while their grandfather supervised from his custom-built deck, I finally understood what my grandfather had meant about preserving things that matter. It wasn't just about maintaining old buildings or fighting corrupt officials. It was about protecting the values that make communities worth living in. Karen had learned the hard way that power without principle is temporary, but communities built on mutual respect and genuine care for each other can last forever. Sometimes the quiet person does hold all the cards, especially when those cards were dealt by someone who loved them enough to prepare for any challenge that might come. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won through force or anger, but through patience, preparation, and staying true to the values that truly matter. Ethan's story reminds us that bullies may seem powerful in the moment, but communities built on genuine care and mutual respect will always outlast those built on fear and control. When we stand up for what's right, we're not just protecting ourselves, we're protecting everyone who comes after us. Have you ever faced a neighborhood tyrant or someone who tried to abuse their authority? How did you handle it? And what would you do differently knowing what you know now? Your experiences matter, and sharing them helps others feel less alone in their struggles. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and consider subscribing to Happer Stories for more tales of everyday heroes who prove that justice, patience, and community spirit can overcome even the most determined bullies. Share this with someone who needs to remember that the quiet ones often hold the most powerful cards.